before Philip II of Macedonia and Alexander the Great ended Thessalian independence, events in Thessaly were shaped by the tyrants of Pherae. Thessaly is a region of Greece which comprises two large plains delimited by mountains. In the south, the Orthris Mountains extend west from the sea to the Pindus Range, which stretches north to the Cambunian Mountains. The Cambunian Mountains form the northern border of Thessaly, separating it from Macedonia. The mountains of Magnesia, including the ultra Mount Ossa, extend southwest into the Aegean Sea, with a hook-like end curving round to enclose the Bay of Pagasae. The two plains are separated by a range of low hills extending from the Cambunian Mountains to the northwestern corner of the Bay of Pagasae. The Peneus River and its tributaries are drained by the eastern upper plain and the western lower plain. The Peneus cuts through the Tempe Valley around the northern side of Ossa and flows into the Aegean. During the Greek Dark Ages, an ancient tribe, the Thessali, crossed the Pindus mountain range from the west and conquered the plains. Some of the vanquished fled to Boeotia. Others sought refuge on the surrounding mountains and gave their names to these regions. In the north, the Pahybi of Pahybia. In the southwest, the Dolopes of Dolopia. In the south, the Achaeans of Achaia. And the Magnetes of Magnesia. The Thessali established baronial estates on the plains. The natives, who remained on the plains after the conquest, called Penastai, made a treaty with the Thessali. The terms relegated the Penastai to serfdom, but also prevented banishment or capital punishment to be inflicted on the Penastai by their Thessalian masters. Under this regime, the Penastai worked the barons' expansive lands, and the barons' wealth became proverbial. Thessaly was divided into four regions known as tetrads. The upper plain was split between two of the tetrads, Thessaliotis, south of the Peneus, the region the Thessali had first conquered, and Hestiotis, north of the Peneus. Pelasgiotis consisted of the lower plain between the Peneus and the Bay of Pagasae, and the low hills between the plains. And lastly, Thyotis covered the southern parts of Thessaly, from Dolopia in the west, the Malian Gulf in the south, the sea in the east, and the low hills between the plains in the north. At some later time, the geographical regions known as tetrads became loose political entities called tetrarchies. Each tetrarchy was likely governed by a tetrarch and an assembly of free Thessalians of the tetrad. The tetrarchy of Pelasgiotis asserted authority over the Pahybi, and that of Thyotis over the Achaeans. Aleuas, the founder of the aristocratic Aleuadae, devised the Thessalian koinon around the end of the 7th century BC. The koinon was a wartime national union of the tetrarchies. The koinon was headed by a tagus, probably elected by the tetrarchies. The koinon mobilised the Thessalian national army, comprising 6,000 cavalry and 10,000 hoplites, which were commanded by the tagus. The army was levied from klaroi, landed estates. Each klaroi was required to provide 80 hoplites and 40 horse. To help pay for a war, an early tagus, Skopas, introduced a war tax levied on the mountain tribes, who in times of war were subject to the koinon rather than the tetrarchies. Penastai were not required to serve in the army of the koinon. Instead, they would continue to work the land, meaning no shortage in soldiers needing to tend the fields, nor shortage in food. The tagia, the position held by the tagus, was monopolised by members of the three dominant aristocratic families: the Aleuadae, the Scopadae, founded by Skopas, possibly a son of Aleuas, and the Echecratidae. During the 6th century, probably with the powerful koinon army, the Thessalians at first exerted influence over neighbouring states. However, this influence began to wane, possibly because of infighting between the Aleuadae, the Scopadae, and the Echecratidae, all vying for the tagia. By the 5th century, Thessalians, discontented with their positions and prospects, as well as the barons' lordship and infighting, moved to the polis. Each polis struck its own coins, a sign of independence. Admitted as citizens freed Penastai, as well as free Thessalian local smallholders. In doing so, each polis exerted influence over the land surrounding its walls. Some of the barons were willing to cede influence over their respective areas to the polis, whereas some noble families began living in the cities whilst maintaining their expansive external estates and involving themselves in the typically two-faction city politics. The cause of the nobles was checked by the commons, that of the commons by the nobles. Thus the polis, rather than the ancient tetrarchy, became the relevant political body, and the relevancy of the koinon withered. There were several polis in Thessaly. The less notable were Tricca and Gomphi in Hestiotis, the latter of which controlled the main pass between Thessaly and Epirus, and Cranon, along with the very ancient Scotusa, both set in the low hills separating the upper and lower plains. The three most notable were Pharsalus, Larissa, and Pherae. Pharsalus in Thessaliotis, with its acropolis, sat atop a saddle-shaped rock protruding from the northern face of Mount Narthacius, the upper plain stretching northwards before it, watered by the Enepius and Apidanus rivers which formed a lush marsh before it. Larissa was located on a small hill rising from the lower plain of Palescaiotis, protected on its west, north and east by a meander in the Peneus. It controlled a point of convergence between the two routes from Macedonia, a first via Oluson, and a second via the Vale of Tempe. Pherae citadel was located on a small hill at the south of the lower plain of Palescaiotis, the town sprawling down the southern side towards the fountain of Hyperia. Pherae controlled Pagasai, a town set beside the sea and the bay. It controlled the Thessalian import and export trade. The main export commodity was corn, which was dispatched to Greek polis elsewhere, which lacked the expansive plainlands for local production and which at times lacked corn due to war. This served to make Pheraian grain merchants very wealthy. The Aleuadae estates covered the land around Larissa, those of the Scopadae the land around Cranon, and the Echicratidae Pharsalus. So in these cities the aristocrats opposed the policies of the popular party, supported by the poorer citizens. Of the three foremost polis, Pherae was the only which lacked aristocratic influence, and so there does not seem to have been the two opposing factions to check a popular citizen establishing a tyranny over the polis. Unrest in the region would soon see the rise of the first of the tyrants of Pherae. Little is known of Lycophron's early life. It is known that Lycophron was from Pherae, and that he was wealthy when he died because of the wealth he bequeathed to his wife and sons. Larissaeans were discontented with some of the profits from local corn production, enriching non-aristocratic merchants who exported it. Pagasai was Pherae's port town, so these merchants were likely Pheraians, and so it may have been that Lycophron was a wealthy grain merchant. The first two Pheraian tyrants were popular, so Lycophron likely shared his wealth with a portion of the rabble, thereby to secure a group of loyal supporters. Around 406 BC, Critias, an Athenian exile, later one of the 30, and an otherwise unknown Prometheus, armed the Penestae against their masters in an attempt to establish a democracy in Thessaly. The political order of Thessaly does not seem to have changed, but the resulting unrest caused may have lasted some years. Furthermore, following the end of the Peloponnesian War in 404 BC, and before the start of the 10,000s expedition in 401 BC, there was an ample pool of unemployed men, trained in the art of war, who could be hired as mercenaries to fight the internecine wars of the Hellenes. Lycophron likely hired a body of mercenaries at this time. Before the tumult caused by Critias and Prometheus' schemes dissipated, and without an aristocratic party in Pherae to oppose him, Lycophron made himself tyrant of Pherae, supported by arms and a portion of the populace. Lycophron's tyranny enjoyed popular support in Pherae, and set an example for ambitious men of neighbouring Thessalian cities, as well as people wishing to be ruled by a man they supported. This was particularly worrying for the Aleuadae, once powerful barons, now successful leaders of an aristocratic faction in Larissa. They dominated the local magistracy, and by this, control of the freemen's agora, where the only traders present were invited by the magistracy. The aristocracy in Larissa, led by Aristippus and Aleuadae, must have looked to crush the new commoner prince of Pherae. In September 403 BC, Aristippus and Lycophron face each other in battle. Xenophon writes, "At about the time of an eclipse of the sun, that Lycophron of Pherae, who wanted to make himself ruler of all Thessaly, defeated in battle those who opposed him, namely the Larissaeans and others, and slew many of them." There was an annular eclipse on the 3rd of September 403 BC, so this decisive battle was probably late in the campaigning season of 403 BC. It can be no surprise that Lycophron, with his proficient, well-paid mercenaries, defeated the Larissaean troops under the command of Aristippus, for whom the majority cannot have had a great fondness. This defeat had repercussions for the Aleuadae, who were replaced with a new, more moderate oligarchical government. The new moderates, under the guise of Patrios Politeia, meaning fathers' politics, sought to return the government to its ancient form, probably to conciliate parts of the populace, and thereby maintain their position. The new moderates conferred citizenship on a large number of men. In Aristotle's Politics, Gorgias of Leontini jokes, "Mortars are what are made by the mortar makers, and the citizens of Larissa are those who are made by the magistrates, for it is their trade to make Larissaeans." From this time on, Thessalian domestic disputes would lead to the involvement of external powers, which would prevent concord in Thessaly and leave it vulnerable to falling under the yoke. Aristippus sought aid from a powerful friend to help him regain control of Larissa. As Xenophon writes, Aristippus the Thessalian chanced to be a friend of Cyrus, and since he was hard pressed by his political opponents at home, he came to Cyrus and asked him for 3 months' pay for 2,000 mercenaries, urging that in this way he could get the better of his opponents, and Cyrus gave him 6 months' pay for 4,000, and requested him not to come to terms with his opponents until he had consulted with him. Thus, the army in Thessaly again was being secretly maintained by him. In early 401 BC, in preparation for his ill-fated march against Artaxerxes, his rival and older brother, Cyrus instructed Aristippus to effect a reconciliation with his adversaries at home and send him the army which he had. In addition to the mercenaries, Aristippus sent Cyrus a Thessalian contingent comprising 1,000 hoplites and 500 peltasts under the command of Menon. But this doesn't seem to have been enough time for Aristippus to put his aristocrats back in power. There was political unrest in the city, and Aristippus now had a serious reduction in the number of men under his command, possibly fewer than he started with. Aristippus was forced to seek assistance from elsewhere. With the conclusion of the Peloponnesian War in 404 BC, Archelaus, the king of Macedonia, who had supplied Athens with timber for ships in the war, looked to check Spartan expansion north, as well as make a province of the lucrative Thessalian lands. In 426 BC, the Spartans had founded a colony at Heraclea in the Sparichius Valley, which controlled the road north to Thessaly. A couple of decades later, the Macedonians under Archelaus controlled the Pahaibia, whilst possibly secretly encouraging Larissaean political issues to help spread their influence southward into Thessaly. Given their proximity, and probably confident that the Macedonians would jump at the chance to interfere, Aristippus requested help from Archelaus. Macedonian troops were dispatched and admitted into the city, and by force removed the moderates and reinstalled the aristocrats. Archelaus himself was granted citizenship of Larissa, and to ensure his reorganisation lasted, he left a Macedonian garrison in the city and took 10 boys from noble families to live as hostages at the Macedonian court. Archelaus's meddling in Thessalian affairs displeased the Spartans, who also wished to extend their influence into the plains, so much so that the Spartans refused to admit Macedonia to the confederation of Spartan allies. It seemed likely that their mutual interest in Thessaly would soon lead to war. War became more likely in 400 BC when, to counter the actions of Archelaus, the Spartans offered to expel the Macedonian garrison from Larissa. A pamphlet, the Peripoliteus, was circulated arguing in favour of the Spartan offer. Notably, whilst the pamphlet argues in favour of Spartan aid, it makes no mention of Lycophron, who had so recently defeated the Larissaeans in battle. From this it can be inferred that Lycophron was likely allied in some capacity with the Spartans. However, Macedonian influence in Larissa, along with the likelihood of war, would come to an end in the winter of 400 to 399. Archelaus had made promises to 2 of his lovers. To Craterus, he had promised one of his daughters in marriage but had married both daughters to other men, and to Helenacrates of Larissa he had promised to restore him to his country. The 2 conspired and killed Archelaus during a hunt. Archelaus's immediate successors were less ambitious than him, and Macedonian meddling in Larissa and Thessaly appears to have evaporated at this time. In 399, the Spartans reaffirmed their desire to expand northward by extirpating civil discord in Heraclea. Diodorus relates, the Lacedaemonians sent Euripides there to restore order. As soon as Euripides arrived in Heraclea, he called an assembly of the people and surrounded them with his hoplites. He arrested the authors of the discord and put them all to death, some 500 in number. And since the inhabitants of Otae had revolted, he made war on them, subjected them to many hardships, and forced them to leave their land. The majority of them, together with their children and wives, fled into Thessaly. After this, the Spartans installed a garrison at Pharsalus, almost certainly supported by their local ally Lycophron. Also around this time, Aristippus vanishes from the historical record. In his place, heading an aristocratic oligarchy, is Medius, probably an Aleuad who inherited the position from Aristippus. A state of war existed between Medius and Lycophron for several years, no doubt because Lycophron sought domination of all Thessaly, and Medius wished to maintain the old order of land baron supremacy. By 395, Medius requested aid from the council formed in Corinth of Sparta's enemies, namely the Boeotians, Athenians, Corinthians, and the Argives. The council dispatched 2,000 soldiers to Medius. Once the troops arrived, Medius seized control of Pharsalus, possibly by treachery, and sold the inhabitants, including its Spartan garrison, into slavery. This must have been a major victory, because the Larissaeans issued didrachms to celebrate the vanquishment of the Spartans in Thessaly. With a part of his force, Medius garrisoned Pharsalus. Meanwhile, part of the 2,000 sent by the council left Medius and marched south to Heraclea. They were admitted under the cover of darkness by a traitor, and massacred the Lacedaemonians, whilst allowing other Peloponnesians to leave in peace. Then they summoned the Trachinians, whom had been displaced by the Lacedaemonians, to resettle them in the city. With the removal of the Lacedaemonian garrisons in Pharsalus and Heraclea, decades of work of expansion into northern Greece was undone. But a potential greater disaster loomed. Agesilaus, the Eurypontid king of Sparta, had been campaigning in Asia Minor and returned to Greece in 394 BC, the year after the dual disasters of Pharsalus and Heraclea. Xenophon writes, "And Agesilaus, passing through Macedonia, arrived in Thessaly. Then the Larissaeans, Trononians, Scotusians, and Pharsalians, who were allies of the Boeotians, and in fact all the Thessalians except those of them who chanced at the time to be exiles, followed after him and kept molesting him. And for a time he led the army in a hollow square, with one half of the horsemen in front and the other half at the rear. But when the Thessalians, by charging upon those who were behind, kept interfering with his progress, he sent along to the rear the vanguard of horsemen also, except those about his own person. Now when the two forces were formed in line of battle against one another, the Thessalians, thinking that it was not expedient to engage as cavalry in a battle with hoplites, turned round and slowly retired, and the Greeks very cautiously followed them. Agesilaus, however, perceiving the mistakes which each side was making, sent the very stalwart horsemen who were about his person, and ordered them not only to give word to the others to pursue with all speed, but to do likewise themselves, and to not give the Thessalians a chance to face around again. And when the Thessalians saw them rushing upon them unexpectedly, some of them fled, others turned about, and others, in trying to do this, were captured while their horse was turned half round. But Polycarmus the Pharsalian, who was the commander of the cavalry, turned round and fell fighting, together with those about him. When this happened, there followed a headlong flight on the part of the Thessalians, so that some of them were killed and others were captured. At all events, they did not stop until they had arrived at Mount Narthacium. On that day, accordingly, Agesilaus set up a trophy between Pras and Narthacium, and remained on the field of battle, greatly pleased with his exploit, in that he had been victorious over the people who pride themselves particularly on their horsemanship, with the cavalry that he had himself gathered together. And on the following day he crossed the Achaean mountains of Phthia, and marched on through a friendly country all the rest of the way, even to the boundaries of the Boeotians. It is possible that Lycophron assisted Agesilaus, but there is no evidence to positively suggest that he did. Nothing further is recorded about Lycophron, nor his adversary, Medius. However, in his book on the history of animals, Aristotle incidentally records the fate of Medius's garrison at Pharsalus. Aristotle writes, "In districts where the food be insufficient for more than 2 birds, ravens are only found in isolated pairs. When their young are old enough to fly, the parent couple first eject them from the nest and by chase them from the neighbourhood. The raven lays 4 or 5 eggs. About the time when the mercenaries under Medius were slaughtered at Pharsalus, the districts about Athens and the Peloponnese were left destitute of ravens, from which it would appear that these birds have some means of intercommunicating with one another. Lycophron can be credited with the establishment of a de facto monarchy at Pherae. His military victories were limited, as he did not come close to his aim of ruling all of Thessaly. But importantly, Lycophron thwarted the efforts of the local aristocracy at Larissa to put down his tyranny and restore the status quo. And in doing so, he paved the way for his successor, and the greatest of the tyrants of Pherae, his son, Jason.